preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Letty and I don't agree about a good many things, which is why her friendship is so valuable to me. I'm a flaming Freudian. Letty is a charter member of the Unconscious is a Myth School. I use language the way it was taught me. Letty cleans up my act, chastising me for each male pronoun that slips out my lips. Our difference has brought me pleasure, interested me, gratified me for a long time. The truth is, though I might kick a bit, I would follow her anywhere. When it comes to the real world, where power and action are the chips, Letty knows what to do. Any arc she builds, I'm jumping on. Anytime she tells me to write a letter, join a march, I do it. I've been sitting around watching Letty affect the real world for over 25 years. I go to meetings on some good cause or another, and I get dreamy. I am lazily waiting for the Messiah while Letty moves forward. She always sees the problem. She sits alert in the room, listens to everyone, and people do go on with private agendas, pet peeves, and grand visions. And then she, with her gentle voice, clarifies the options, outlines the disagreements, and announces a plan of action. She is the master of the possible and the reconciler of egos, and a balm on the stormy waters of naysayers and plain lunatics. In short, she is a political genius. You have to have been there to believe me, but it's true. As a feminist and a Jewish feminist, she has been in the right battles, at the beginning, in the middle, and wherever we are right now, maybe in the soup. She has political imagination, courage, and clarity. I admire her. Besides, she has written a large number of books: How to Make It in a Man's World, Getting Yours, Growing Up Free, Among Friends, and this last book, the newest one, Deborah, Golda, and Me. She has been an editor for the Stories for Free Children, an editorial consultant on Free to Be Me. She's a founder and editor of Ms. Magazine, a columnist for Moment Magazine, a contributing editor for Family Circle. She has done hers columns for the New York Times Book Review and travel pieces. She has had her articles collected in over 25 anthologies. She's in Who's Who in America, Who's Who of American Women, the Who's Who of American Jewry. She was a Poynter Fellow in Journalism at Yale University, a Fellow at the MacDowell Colony and the Edna St. Vincent Millay Colony. She received the Gloria Steinem Women of Vision Award and the Woman in Communications Clarion Award. She is the chairperson of Americans for Peace Now, National Council of Authors Guild. She's a founding director of the Ms. Foundation and on the board of advisors of Tikkun Magazine and on the UJA Task Force on Jewish Women. She's a founding member of the Women's Political Caucus. And that's not all, but that's all I'm going to tell you. Letty is married to a man who tells the best jokes in New York and happens to be a lawyer, Bertrand Pogrebin. They have 3 children, Abigail, Robin, and David. I look forward to hearing her tonight. Then I get to ask a few questions. Then we'll have questions from the audience. I warn you about your questions. What they say about Mother Nature is also true of Letty Pogrebin. Maybe that warning is for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think the smartest thing I ever did was have a brilliant writer for a friend. I think that introduction, if it wasn't so immodest, I would try to publish it. It's beautifully written, and I thank you so much. Being here tonight and seeing a few faces I recognize reminds me of the woman who survived the Johnstown flood. This woman had a fairly innocuous life, didn't leave much of a footprint in the sands of time, But she did manage to survive the Johnstown flood and never let anyone forget it. Everywhere she went, she talked about it. She regaled people with her survival story. And finally, at the end of a long life, she died and found herself standing before St. Peter. She wasn't one of us. At the heavenly gates. And St. Peter said, we do something quite wonderful here. We allow the residents to do whatever it is they'd like to do for all of eternity. What would you like to do? And the woman said, scratching her chin, well, actually, the only thing I'd really like to do is just to have a bunch of people I could tell about how I survived the Johnstown flood. So St. Peter thought a minute, walked over to Cloud 9, gathered a few people around, had a little powwow, came back and told the woman, it's been arranged. I've got an audience ready for you. You can just waft over there to Cloud 9 and start talking. But I have to warn you, Noah's in the audience. So you are my Noahs. And I'm sure I'll hear from you about your flood experiences. But I'm here to tell you my story, which is a story I tell in Deborah, Golda, and Me. And for me, after 6 previous books, it's been a great joy to be able to write personally. This is a memoir, and I have made myself vulnerable in this book in ways I never have before. And people have asked me as I've gone around the country in the 4 weeks since the book's been published, why did you do it? Why write this book, and why now? And I think it isn't a facile answer to say that I started writing this book when I started confronting the fact that I was going to turn 50. I'm now 52. But when you're facing a watershed moment, and certainly in terms of age, I think of 50 as a moment of truth, you sort of want to make sense about everything that's come before and figure out how you want to direct your future years. You get a sense of existential shock. You realize you don't have as much left as you had before. And for me, there were a lot of loose ends to make sense of. So I started going deep into my memories. And what came out was this book. It was supposed to be a novel. A novel didn't come. That'll be harder work. The title came immediately, Deborah, Golda, and Me, because I know how important those 2 women were in the formation of my sense of possibility, and also because these 2 women are symbolic or metaphoric for the sections of the book in which I describe 2 kinds of journeys. Deborah is the spiritual journey, a full circle that I will describe, and Golda, a political or secular odyssey, which led me to the me that I am. Not that I equate myself with my role models, but in fact, I think it's a wonderful thing to find role models as a woman, and certainly as a Jewish woman. Deborah, for those of you who haven't recently read the book of Judges, was a judge, a priestess, a prophet, and a military commander. She did it all. She's in the Bible in her own right, not as somebody's wife or mother. She was brave and stalwart, and also at the end of her victorious battle, she reigned over 40 years of peace and dispensed justice from under her fig tree. For me, the Deborah section had to begin in childhood because my spiritual life started in my family. I grew up in an observant, conservative household. I call it high conservative, bordered on Orthodox at times, but made accommodations. I grew up in a household with 2 very different parents who gave me experience dealing with dualities and contradictions. Having to reconcile my parents' influence in my life was good training for having to reconcile all the other contradictions, including Judaism and feminism, which is the basic conundrum of this book. My mother was an immigrant. She came over at the age of 7 in tatters and in shoes with paper soles and steerage, a story I'm sure many of you share. My mother was always ashamed of having been an immigrant, worked very, very hard to lose her accent and succeeded, was ashamed of her parents who didn't speak English until much, much later, ashamed of the poverty in which her family lived. And shame was a theme that I grew up with. Having to cover for the truth was part of the secrecy in my family. My mother was the kind of Jew that I today value and feel very warmly toward. A mystical, superstitious, old world shtetl kind of Judaism was hers. But at the time, I used to laugh at it. But growing up, I learned all my mother's superstitions until I felt as though I was sort of on speaking terms with the evil eye. My mother would go kanahara whenever anybody would say anything nice about me. She would come to my room at night and lean over me and go on my forehead to excise the evil eye in case anyone had been envious of me, because envy means the next thing is you get struck dead to even it out. So you have to get rid of the envy. My mother wouldn't allow a picture to be taken of a pregnant woman. You had to, if you were spending the first night in a new home, you had to make sure that it had wine and salt and bread in that home before you slept in it. I wasn't allowed to sleep with the moon shining in on me because the moon should only shine on a grave. I couldn't have anything mended while I was in it because you were only supposed to be sewed into your shroud. And I got slapped on the first day when I menstruated, when I was almost 14. And a lot of women had that experience, women raised by women from the old country, but they never knew why they were slapped. I knew why, because after my mother said something in Yiddish, which I wasn't allowed to understand, in order that the family could keeping secrets, you weren't allowed to learn Yiddish. It was also an old world language, so you weren't allowed to learn it. But she said something in Yiddish, and I asked her what it meant, and she said, "May this be the worst pain you ever have as a woman." And thinking back, my judgment is that was a very wise blessing. With all of that, my mother also had a very relentlessly pure sense of Judaism. She created an atmosphere around the holidays and Shabbat that I will always feel in some way embodied Jewish practice and Jewish ritual for me in a way very different from my father, who I'll explain in a minute. My mother created a true Jewish mood and atmosphere and ambiance, a kind of permeated air that was full of spirituality and God's presence. Her mystical behavior was a measure of her belief in God and in a divine power. And again, as I say, I laughed at it then, but I've carried it with me into my adult life in some form because I think it was so pure and true, and also because she died when I was 15 and I don't have that much to remember her by. When you're going to lose a parent at that age and you don't know it, you don't store up enough memories. In any case, my mother also was a very observant Jew in terms of kashrut. I mean, she not only cooked all the right things and made the table look good and decorated the house with whatever were the holiday symbols, but she did keep kosher, and she cared enough about it because her mother wouldn't have eaten in her house if she hadn't kept kosher. But my mother also cared about the fact that I was very skinny, and this wasn't allowed in our family for a Jewish child to be skinny. And so my mother, in her very simple way, looked around at all of my non-Jewish friends and realized that they were all strapping and strong, and I was the skinniest, and the difference had to be bacon. Now, my mother, however, kept kosher, So how was she going to reconcile these contradictions? Well, she got a pot, a separate pot, and she kept it in a double paper bag. And when she made this treat, she opened the windows, because as those of you who aren't kosher know, bacon has a fairly lingering fragrance. And she served to me every single day on a paper plate so that I would get fat, several strips of this thing that she would call lamb chops on paper. She put it on a paper plate, so nothing ever touched anything in the house. Everything went right into the paper bag, and the windows took it out, and so on. Once I ate at the home of a Gentile friend who served me something that she called a BLT, and that's when I discovered what lamb chops on paper really was. Looking back, I find this so lovable because my mother was trying to satisfy everybody's needs. Her mother, who wouldn't eat at our house without kashrut, and me, who needed to be fattened up. And it's a measure of my mother's personality. She was very dedicated to other people's needs. My father was a very different story, and living with the disparity in sex roles and the disparity in sort of Judaic styles was really a bit of a schizophrenic experience. My father was born in this country and would never let you forget it. Called himself a Connecticut Yankee because he was born in New Haven with the century in the year 1900. He was an extraordinarily well-educated man for his generation, Jewishly and otherwise. He became a lawyer. He graduated from NYU Law School in 1923, when everyone around us was, had quit school, as my mother did, incidentally, in the 6th or 8th grade, if they were lucky. My father was extremely well-versed in Talmud. He studied Talmud. He was a Baal Koreh. He read the Torah. He taught Hebrew school. He could have been a rabbi, everyone said. He chose not to. He said it very often as well. And my father taught me by bat mitzvah. My haftorah was Deborah, yet another reason for the title of this book. And my father was really quite impatient with childhood, except insofar as I would be interested in what he was interested in. So I understood very early that if I wanted his attention, I ought to become involved in his cases and in his Talmudic studies and his discourses. And those were the conversations I had with my father. I don't remember him playing with me, quite frankly. My father was also the biggest of the big machers. We lived in Jamaica in Queens. He was president of the Jamaica Jewish Center for 6 consecutive terms. He was county commander of the Jewish War Veterans. He was the head of our local UJA, Israel Bonds, Federation, B'nai B'rith, you name it. He was at the top. And I tell in the book about the pleasures of that for me as a child. Being the little daughter of the big macher, I got to exercise certain privileges around the synagogue, and I also had some fairly unforgettable experiences. One that I will never forget is having gone to a Jewish War Veterans Convention at the Concord or Grossinger's, and my father sitting me on his lap up on the dais, and next to us was the shrunken little man who was really almost invisible in his uniform. And my father said, "Bunny," because that's what he used to call me, "this is the oldest man you'll ever meet." And the man put out his scarecrow hand, and I shook it, and he said, "You've just shook the hand that shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln." And that's a pretty unforgettable thing for a 5-year-old. So I carry a lot of very flashy memories of my father, of his brilliance, of our after-dinner discourse, of the special privileges associated with just hanging around him. But my father's Jewish organizations were what I have come to call my sibling rivals, because he was almost never home. He didn't have affairs with women, he had affairs with organizations. he was hardly home, and my mother suffered from it, and I felt as though he was a kind of knight in armor, but not a dad. Which became difficult for me in later life, as I look back on it, at least, in terms of Israel. Because my father's dedication to Israel was so wholehearted that I really felt it was like a sister who got his love. And it took me until I was 37 years old to go to Israel for the first time, which is really quite extraordinary for someone raised in a hyper-Zionist household. But I think I was rebelling, and I think I was punishing him. In any case, I felt I was his spiritual heir. I also felt I understood that he had power over the Judaism that we practiced and that I knew and that I grew up in. What my father said was, and when he made exceptions, as for his smoking on Shabbat, because he was almost a chain smoker, and he would smoke and then put his cigarette out maybe 4 or 5 blocks away from shul, and go in and have and participate in the service and come out and walk 5 blocks and immediately light up. He was also someone who, long before there was a teshuvah, a ruling in conservative Judaism that allowed for driving on Shabbat, my father drove because he thought it was foolish. This wasn't like you were working a horse or making a fire. Just driving a car wasn't labor. So he drove on Shabbat, but he also parked the car 3 blocks away so that he could arrive like a very frum leader of his community on foot. So I knew my father as someone who had full authority in terms of defining our Judaism, but also who cut corners to suit him. That gives you, I guess, a basic spiritual picture. I was a fairly well-educated Hebrew school kid. I graduated from Hebrew high school. I went to Yeshiva of Central Queens, for anybody in the audience who's also an alumni of that school. And I was bat mitzvah, one of the earliest females to be bat mitzvah in conservative Judaism. That was in 1952. Now, with this background, I hope you'll understand why there was such a break for me when my mother died. And the first night when we were sitting Shiva, for anyone in the audience who isn't Jewish, that's the 7 days of mourning, the first 7 days of mourning. And we were holding the Shiva service, and there came a moment when my father looked around the room, and although the room was full of people, there were only 9 Jews in the room. That is, only 9 Jewish men. And my father went into sort of a flurry over that. And I said to him, "Dad, you can count me in the minyan. I know this. It's my mother. I've been bat mitzvah. Count me in this minyan, and let's have the service." And he looked very sternly at me and said, "You know it's forbidden." And he called the synagogue and sent for a 10th man, a stranger, to come and make the minyan for the Kaddish service for my mother. And it was really a sort of a psychic break for me. After all that Judaism had meant for me, and it had been so central to my life, to my family, to my childhood, I suddenly felt, as I say in the book, like a shadow, like an illegitimate child in the minyan, not counting. And I turned my back on communal Judaism, on the Judaism of rules. I did not affiliate with any synagogue for well over 15 years. I didn't affiliate with any organizations that had a Jewish component for many years, almost 20. For 15 years, I only went to synagogue on the high holy days. I still felt that I had sins to confess, and that it was meant to be done communally. I bought a ticket to sit in any overflow service in any synagogue in the city, and I've been to all of them. As long as they don't have a mechitza, I just signed up and went. I didn't feel connected I married a Jewish man who, although raised with a lot of Yiddishkeit, and he's here, and his mother's here, and his sister's here, as well as my kids, he really wouldn't have cared one way or the other. He was what is called a red diaper baby. He was raised in a household where religion was the opiate of the people. So it was really up to me to determine how much Judaism there would be in our married life and with our children. And over the years, I sort of refined or distilled a kind of Judaism that was, 9 parts my mother and 1 part my father's rituals. We did Shabbat informally and not all the time, and we observed Hanukkah, and we have our Seders, and I taught my kids as much as I felt was relevant about the Jewish ethic and Jewish history and the personages of history. I have deep regrets that they were the casualties of my rebellion, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't have done it any other way. And as for my husband, I always characterize his relationship to Judaism by telling a story. He had to put up with peculiar behavior on my part because when we were courting, there wasn't a clue that I had a spiritual self. And then we get married on December 8th, and we go away on our honeymoon, and I unpack a suitcase, and in it is a menorah and 8 presents for him. I think it was a fairly large shock because we had been dating since June, and I had gone to High Holy Day services, and I had made him a pre-fast meal, and that was about all the Judaism he saw in me. But Hanukkah meant a great deal to me, and so I brought Hanukkah with me, and he kind of accommodated himself to each of these bizarre expressions of mine, and he learned the prayers over the course of time because of all the holiday meals that we had. And then in 1976, when we took that first trip to Israel, we went to the wall. I don't pray in segregated space, but I do feel very deeply connected to the history, and the wall means a lot to me. So we went there, and I went to the women's section, which is infuriatingly small compared to the men's section. And the women pray very quietly, and the men are raucous and proud and joyous and loud. My husband went to the men's section, and almost immediately as he was walking down the plaza, those of you who know it, there's a long plaza before you get to the wall, he was surrounded by a bunch of black hat, Hasidim. And they said to him in Yiddish, "Do you speak Yiddish?" And he does. He comes out of that sort of cultural background, and he said yes. And so they all surrounded him, and they walked him to the wall, and they accompanied him to the wall. And he got there, and he found himself strangely awed. It touched him. It reached him. And as he stood there, he told me he felt that English was somehow inappropriate. And so he recited the only prayer he knows, the prayer over the wine. And he assumed that the chassids who were at his side must have said, "Oh my God, there's a wino at the wall. We've brought a wino here." But that's just to describe the sort of the family situation that I created once I was an adult and once I was forming a family of my own. It was very makeshift and complicated by all the overtones of my memories of my father's brand of Judaism, which excludes and hurts. Oddly enough, my way back to communal, connected, collective Judaism came through as much of a feminist event as the feminist type crisis of being locked out of the minyan, and that is that we go to a place in Fire Island, Saltaire, a community where one year a group of men decided, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to go back to the city, and we formed our own prayer group and did a Rosh Hashanah service. And they were talking about, how they were going to get the honey cake and the wine and some yarmulkes, and they would, borrow some machzorim prayer books for the High Holy Days. And they would go down to the Lower East Side and someone would get a shofar and everything was getting planned. Then all of a sudden they realized nobody knew how to daven. None of these men, if they'd been religious, it would have been out of the question not to go back to New York to their synagogue. That these men, many of whom had been bar mitzvah, many not, were not comfortable with prayer book Hebrew and didn't know which prayers should be excerpted for a short service and so on. As I listened, and that was in 1970, I suddenly felt this overpowering desire to step forward, and I did. I took ownership of my Jewish identity and my competence, and I said, well, I can do it. And in 1970, don't forget, there were no women rabbis or women cantors. Women were not accepted in the minyan, except in Reconstructionist Judaism, a fairly small branch. Women didn't have aliyahs. So it was a bit of a revolutionary act for these men to sort of take me in and say, sure, do it, be our leader. But I suspect when you have no choice and someone comes along and says, I can do it, it's a little bit more tempting to accept. And they did accept me, and I became the chazanit, the cantor of this Fire Island congregation for 13 years. And I count that as my second bat mitzvah, the one that I did voluntarily, the one that accompanied a real journey of reconnection, reaffiliation with my roots. And in the course of that time and all the years since, I have found it possible, and I suspect many of you have done the same sort of bartering, to kind of balance my need for tradition, and coming out of a high conservative background, I do need a lot of that, with my need for feminist transformation. I found it at long last at a synagogue called B'nai Jeshurun, which means a lot to me and has, for me, deep resonances with my childhood, the melodies and just the way the service operates. And I've also found it possible to have a kind of feminist Judaism that enriches my traditional Judaism. And that involves many small acts, but the biggest one and the most meaningful one and the most consistent one that I'll share with you briefly is the Feminist Seder, which is approaching its 17th year. A group of us, 7 Seder sisters or Seder mothers, plan it every year. We organize the food. We each are able to invite 2 guests apiece, and we choose where it will be and what the theme will be. We have different themes. We've had such themes as mothers and daughters, or our feelings about Israel on her 40th anniversary, or Lamed Vav Nix, the question of the 36 just men and who are the 36 just women in our lives. Loss and separation was a theme one year when many of us had experienced deaths close to us. We speak to the theme, each of the guests, but we also conform to certain of the structural requirements of a Seder. We have a feminist Haggadah. We use the one that's been written by Esther Broner, a writer you may know, and Naomi Nimrod, who does a parallel Seder in Haifa. Our Haggadah provides for the 10 plagues, but in our case, we recite the 10 plagues of women, the plagues of being unwanted and discriminated against and harassed and undervalued and overlooked. And we also ask the 4 questions, but they're the 4 questions of women. One woman might say, why do all the men I know marry non-Jewish women? There are lots of questions that women have to ask. Our daughters have come to the Seder every year. Mine have been there since they were, I guess, 10 years old, and they're 26 now. And our daughters have taken up the cudgels and have organized and run a Seder of their own. We wash each other's hands. We recite the names of our foremothers. It's sad to say that most of us can't go back any further than 3 generations. I say I'm Letty, daughter of Cyril, daughter of Jenny. My daughters can go 1 more generation, but that's all we have. So we try to fill in the gaps on other Jewish women and talk about women in history and women in the biblical period and women in the Talmud and women in our own lives who we want to honor, and to take them out of the kitchen where they have been the servers and the silent ones. So that tells you, I think, the spiritual journey, which has brought me to a place I feel comfortable in and at home in, and it may not satisfy anybody's orthodoxy or even anybody's conservatism, but it allows me to be both a Jew and a woman of dignity. Now the Golda part is a lot easier to describe. The Golda part is the secular political journey. It's easier to describe because for so many years I felt absolutely no need for a worldly Jewish identity. I didn't see why I had to be Jewish in non-Jewish settings. I went to school in Jamaica where there were plenty of Jews, plenty of non-Jews, no anti-Semitism. I went to Brandeis University, mostly Jewish. I didn't experience any need to come forward as a Jew. My career in book publishing and then in magazine publishing, likewise, seemed to call for no forthright self-identification, which doesn't mean I was at all in denial. Quite the opposite. I felt always very comfortable being Jewish, certainly in New York. If you bring a matzah sandwich to lunch during Passover, there are probably 3 other people eating the same sort of thing. You don't feel odd or peculiar and nobody points a finger. I never needed a Jewish identity during all the years at Ms., except when I would be called upon for some kind of, pardon the expression, expertise on an issue that might come up in the editorial process. I played the same role as a kind of a Catholic, observant Catholic did when we did a piece on lesbian nuns. You know, we would ask her, well, is this accurate, or should we have it fact-checked, and so on. I would be the one who would help transliterate a Yiddish or Hebrew phrase. That was basically the extent of my upfront Jewish identity. And it probably would have remained that way. As I said, I hadn't gone to Israel. My father's causes were not mine. It probably would have remained that way had it not been for the International Women's Decade Conferences, sponsored by the UN. The first in Mexico City, the infamous one, in which is on the history books forever as the locus for the Zionism is Racism resolution. The fact that that resolution would emerge from a women's meeting was so astonishing to me. I was totally unprepared. The fact that women would allow that conference to be hijacked for a kind of masculinist adversarial politics when we were supposed to be doing it differently. We were supposed to be universalists. We were supposed to be joining hands across boundaries of class, religion, race, ethnicity, nationality. And here, women were doing it all the same way. It was a grave disappointment to me. I got involved in a petition campaign to protest that resolution, and as a result of that, the government of Israel offered all of us who were organizers of that petition a trip to Israel. And that accounted for the first trip. Oddly enough, again, it was feminism that did it. It was being involved in the women's movement that got me into this world of Israeli politics and concerns that has become such an obsession. I went to Israel and saw all the people that the government has you see, especially a trip of journalists and political people such as we were. And I came back, quite a raving Zionist, and immediately started organizing the Ms. Tour of Israel, which accompanied, an advertisement accompanied an article I wrote on my trip to Israel, which was called A Feminist in the Promised Land. That was the article. And there was a full-page ad that said, "Our sisterhood," meaning the feminist sisterhood as opposed to the temple sisterhood, "is going to Israel. Join us." So 52 women and 4 men signed up, and I became sort of tour director. And instead of doing just what I had seen thanks to the Israeli government, which was quite a remarkable array of sites and people, I added the feminist quotient to it, and we went to battered women's shelters and child care centers, and we met all the women in the Knesset, which is not saying a lot. Although at the moment, with 7 in the Knesset, there are fewer than there ever have been in the history of the state. And we had an extraordinary time fleshing out not only a sense of this pioneering country, but also of the role of women in it, which wasn't quite the mythology I'd grown up with. The posters on my Hebrew school wall with women on tractors, women planting, women sunburned and shoulder to shoulder with their men. I discovered, of course, that the level of discrimination in Israel at that time put them about 20 years behind us. And they're still about 20 years behind us in terms of their rights and roles. That also was the beginning of my interest in Palestinian-Israeli relations. I organized an evening very much in the casual, cover all the bases sort of way, an evening with a Palestinian nationalist feminist, Raimonda Tawil, who presented an entirely credible argument for Palestinian self-determination. But the audience got so hostile that the evening ended in a complete debacle. Shouting, yelling, arguments about terrorism and who had the first rights to the land. And suddenly my mind was abuzz with all of these issues, which would later concern me, maybe almost full-time at this point. 1980 was the second conference of the UN Women's Decade, and that was my wake-up call. That was the conference in Copenhagen. And women's experiences there of vituperation and bullying and physical attacks, virtually, were so unnerving that I suddenly realized that I was working in a movement that might liberate women to hate Jews, and that there was a deep illogic here, and I had to confront my Jewish identity. I had to be able to be responsive to that part of me, the Jewish part of me, when it was threatened, that this was as much my constituency as women, that anti-Semitism was as much my concern as sexism. And suddenly it all sort of tumbled in on me as an absurd kind of false choice that I had made, that I was only going to pick one thing to advocate and care about. In Copenhagen, the sense that somehow or other this was politics disappeared. This wasn't politics. This wasn't a Mid-Eastern debate. Women were saying to other women, the only good Jew is a dead Jew, and Hitler should have finished the job. And clearly, anti-Zionism had been a masquerade for anti-Semitism. So I decided that I was going to test whether anti-Semitism was a phenomenon in the women's movement, of the international women's movement, or whether it existed here as well. And I interviewed over 80 women all over the country and took testimony, really just took down experiences that women had in the context of the women's movement. I wasn't interested in childhood experiences or passers-by. I wanted to know, in the context of this movement that we espouse and that I still feel is a social justice movement of great import, is there a deep, dark, dirty secret, and should we out it, as it were? And in fact, in gathering evidence, it became clear that a case could be made, and I made it in the pages of Ms. Magazine. And there was an enormous outcry, as you might imagine, but there also was a lot of healing that went on. Many women's movement groups all over the country published their own versions of local people's experiences. Give you a few examples. meetings that were called on Yom Kippur, which clearly women couldn't go to, posters that had been put up having to do with Jewish feminist events that were torn down from the walls of women's centers, events at which women's history in the context of Jewish women's history was not included in an overview for a women's conference. For instance, women's contribution to the labor movement or to the women's movement, in fact, was overlooked in the sense that there was a preponderance of Jewish women and it should have been noted. Those kinds of examples, as well as the usual, as well as someone saying, oh, you're very good at publishing, self-publishing feminist books because you people are so good at money, that kind of thing as well. As a result of the sort of cleansing process, I really started to feel much more comfortable being a Jew in the women's movement, much more able to be forthright about Jewish issues when they became relevant. And I did begin to feel that there was a function for a worldly, political Jewish identity. And I then took it the other way, took my feminism into Judaism and began to become active in organized Jewish life, places where there is a deep commitment to social justice and politics, where Jewish organizations play a role in secular life, but don't necessarily reflect the feminist agenda. And that's kind of where I have tried to take myself as a result of the experiences of these years. The me part of the title, Deborah, Golda, and Me, is a synthesis of the spiritual, the political, the feminist, the Jewish, the activist, the writer, and I try to explain how one can try to live one's life with a feminist head and a Jewish heart. And I do that primarily in two areas that have become very important to me. One is Black-Jewish dialogue, and one is Palestinian-Jewish dialogue. The Black Jewish group that I've been part of has been meeting since 1984. It's like a consciousness-raising group. It's very painful to listen to what Blacks are feeling about Jews lately, but my feeling is that we might as well know it. They're going to be feeling it anyway. We can learn from it. We can dispel misconceptions. We can argue. Sometimes we can work together, and sometimes we can enhance our understanding of the other through dialogue. Certainly that's true of the Palestinian-American dialogues I've been part of. The women's dialogue that I'm most connected to has met for 3 intense retreat weekends. We've argued and screamed for 80 hours, and through that process, we've come to very little points of understanding, but we have reached some, and most of all, what I've come away with is an idea of how hard it's going to be for the people who are doing the real thing, which is why it's all the more important that it get going and that it be given the many years that it's in fact going to take. So that, I think, describes a profile of this journey that you'll read about if you care to pick up the book, and I will be signing books later. But I want to end up with an anecdote that I think embodies the struggle. And that is that in 1972, I went to a feminist conference where one of the workshops was run by a sort of New Age California type person who put up signs all around the room. Each sign had a different word on it. One said human, one said woman, wife, mother, black, white, red, yellow, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and on around the room, worker, many one-word definitions. And the facilitator said, don't intellectualize, don't think, just get up and stand under the sign that most epitomizes the essence of your identity. In 1972, I didn't need 5 seconds. I got up and I walked over to the sign that said woman. In 1982, after the Copenhagen UN conference, I would also have not needed 5 seconds. I would have stood up and walked and stood under the sign Jew. And what I'm asking for us all is that we not be forced to choose. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel that way about you. Thank you. I'd like to ask Anne Roiphe to come back and ask me the first few questions, challenges. We can organize a revolution and then eventually turn to you and get your questions.
Let's do some serious talking about the future. I'm feeling very discouraged these days. Every time I talk to you, you usually make me feel better. Please make me feel better. Let's talk about the future of... Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
All right. Sorry. Let's talk about the future of Black-Jewish relations, and let's talk about the women's movement. What's going to happen now?
I was really wishing, as I was watching the Clarence Thomas hearings, that he would not be confirmed so I wouldn't have to talk about these issues. In the backwash of that disappointment, I think I can't cheer you up as much as I might have had that not happened. I think that was really a seismic move backwards for us all. I think it legitimated disbelieving women, and I think it confused sex and race in ways that we have yet to pay for. We will see a lot more dangerous byproducts of that confusion. But in and I will talk about Black-Jewish relations, but I think in terms of the women's movement in general, that is, what is it, where's it going, who's in it, what's it accomplishing, and what's left to do, I'm still optimistic. I'm optimistic, and I think for good reason. The women's movement is so big, you can't see it anymore. It's everywhere. It's all of us, whether we call ourselves feminists or not. Women who work in welfare rights or in childcare or in pro-choice movements, or who work in a labor union caucus for women's interests, or in the House caucus for women, are all in the women's movement. We're all in the women's movement if we are able to identify women's interests without shame and say, I have a right to point out my suffering and to expect attention to be paid, even though not everyone is a woman and not everyone is a feminist. I want my rights to be acknowledged. And I don't think that there are too many young women today who don't feel a sense of entitlement in terms of that kind of insistence. So although it's now an issue-by-issue movement rather than a kind of street mass movement, I wouldn't discount the fact that we're there. Certainly the outpouring of mail on behalf of Anita Hill suggests that we're there, whether under organizational affiliations or not. The power structure is not affected by the fact that we're there. You had only to look at the Senate committee to see that. If we can conclude from that experience that the answer is to elect more women, that having a female sensibility up there would have made a difference, that there would have been some way of mirroring Anita Hill's reality in the eyes of the women looking at her, that she could have seen herself and they could have seen themselves, and therefore all of us could have participated in that chemistry. If that's what we can take away from that experience, it won't be all bad. But the fact is that we're going to have to live with this court for the rest of our, at least my life and a lot of my children's. And when we were all warning, a lot of political type women were warning that if you elect George Bush, you elect this kind of court. It's all just come to pass. I'm afraid this is what the electorate deserves for having bought the lunacy of that platform and that man. Now, very quickly, as to Black-Jewish relations, I don't feel that Crown Heights is the country, but I feel that Crown Heights is a bellwether. It's sort of a warning. The reason why it is so clearly a black Jewish confrontation is obvious. I mean, blacks are black, and therefore you know they're black. Hasidim, because of their dress, are clearly Jews. And so the confrontation was defined as black Jewish, even if it had been economic, if it had been a question of city resources, even if it had been a question of inadequate police protection. One wouldn't know that those were the issues because it was a photo op, black Jewish confrontation. And clearly it became Jewish with the type of invectives that were, I mean, a lot of the same things were said there that were said in Copenhagen by women. And I've written at length in this book about how difficult it is to hear expressions of black anti-Semitism in the light of our sense of Jewish contributions to the civil rights movement. But that's our sense of Jewish contributions. It is not at this point African American sense, sadly. They're not as willing to trade on memories as we are. We know that Stephen Wise and Heschel were marching, arm in arm and helped to form the NAACP, but that's irrelevant now. What's relevant now is we're doing fine. The American dream has delivered for us. And blacks are suffering, and they're in crisis, and their young men are being killed, and their babies are being born with crack addiction, and you know the litany. So I think we have to confront the reality of the difference between our two communities and not keep being so sensitive to and so demanding of disavowals and renunciations of blacks by blacks. I think as much as that's something that we have a right to expect, I think we also have the obligation to decode the anger that fuels black rage. Not the extremists, the Coakleys and the Farrakhan's, but the black rage that's bubbling up and that's becoming quite evident in the polls. Serious, because it's felt more by educated blacks these days than by uneducated blacks.
Shall we have some questions from the audience?
Can we have a little light?
Yeah.
Let there be light.
How about you? I think you're in the fourth row. Yeah. Yes. Will you stand up and talk as loud as you can, and I'll repeat the question.
And it would be nice if you could say your name.
Yeah.
My name is Hillary, and by the way, I also went to Brandeis. Do you see any future for feminism in Israel? Because I understood what you were talking about, and that they are about 20 years behind us. And is there a future for feminism? Do you have contact with a feminist movement there?
Absolutely.
Wait. Let me just repeat this so the people in the back can hear it. The question was from Hillary, who also went to Brandeis. The question was, what is the future for feminism in Israel?
Again, I'm pretty optimistic. I'm well aware that the definition of a Jewish, let's say, definition of a Jewish pessimist is someone who says, oy, 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 it can't get any worse. And the definition of a Jewish optimist is someone who says, oh, yes, it can. But I'm a real optimist. I'm a real optimist. And that's based on the women I know in Israel who are where we were 20 years ago or 15 years ago. They have the fire in the belly that we had then. They have the sense of urgency that we had then. The Israel Women's Network, for example, headed by Alice Shalvey, or the women's peace groups, who are so much on the cutting edge in terms of what they dare and how they're willing to make a feminist analysis of militarism and of peace, gives me a real sense of hope. And the fact that there have been enormous changes, that there have been legal cases that would astound us, as to the primitive nature of the demands, equal retirement benefits, for example, and basic discrimination cases in employment that have been won and that have made permanent systemic change. It's little by little by little, and it's very gravely retarded in its forward movement by the fact that Israel is a siege state. I mean, the fact that there is this sense that everything should take a back seat to security means that if you say, hey, what about me and what about these injustices here, even the Agunot, 10,000 women who are trapped in marriages, unable to get a divorce because their husbands won't grant it to them, unable to remarry and form families, even that, which in the religious context should be a justice issue that at least has some reverberation and can create a groundswell, even that is shoved aside. Wait until we are sure we're safe. Wait until, on any economic issue, wait until we fund the army. Wait until the more important things are taken care of. So the fact that these women are struggling against such attitudes and predispositions gives me enormous faith and a sense of adoration. I just love them for what they do. And anybody who goes to Israel and doesn't plug into that community is really missing something.
The red sweater? Yeah.
You spoke of the American electorate that elected George Bush, and how do you account for that? What is it in that electorate that causes this to happen to the rest of us? And what will it take to change it?
Okay. The question, Letty, why are we in the mess we're in? What can we do about it? You have 30 seconds to answer that question.
If I had an answer, I'd call every one of the Democratic candidates and tell it to him. Yes. Yeah, what can we do about it? Well, I've become more and more convinced that we have to register new voters, that we have to do the kind of dragging that they do for local elections, calling people up and escorting them to the polls and making sure that the right people don't stay home when it matters. I think, that the reason why we have George Bush is because people want to believe in a feel-good message. It started with Reagan, and Bush is presenting the same set of options. Do you want to feel bad and confront how awful things are, or you want to feel good and have Operation Desert Storm? I mean, it's manipulation, it's co-optation of the language, it's a matter of smoke and mirrors so that people don't assess the quality of their own lives realistically. I don't know how to fight that. Those tactics are beyond me. I guess you have to sink to it. But I'm really not an electoral political person, so I don't know those kinds of strategies. I certainly wish those who do will lead the way and tell us how to beat them back.
Okay, let's take a question down here.
Letty, we've spoken together and written to each other. I'm Avalon, and I know that I'm quoting you when you say it would be a disaster if Israel retained the territories, and then you didn't have enough time on my machine to explain.
My poor telephone friends have to put up with this.
Let's just do this question, Letty, for the people in the back. Essentially, the question is, Letty has said that it would be a disaster if Israel retained the territories. What does she mean? How can we solve this particular problem?
That's a feeling I have, not because of what I think, but because I really have spent the last 5 years trying desperately to educate myself in Israel. And because I'm persuaded by the arguments of security experts and intelligence experts such as Ephraim Snen and Yehoshaphat Harkabi, I'm persuaded that the current settlement policy is a disaster for countless reasons I will simply recite them, and if anyone wants to go into them further, I hope we don't have to here. It will skew the whole discussion away from feminist issues, but my feeling is that that the settlements are a disaster economically. They are squeezing dry the public coffers. They are making it impossible for the Aliyah to be conducted in a reasonable and timely way. It is making it unattractive for Soviet Jews to come to Israel. They don't want to settle in a beleaguered territory. They are not leaving Tbilisi and Moscow in order to live next to neighbors who don't want them, in order to live on expropriated land. It's a disaster in terms of dividing the Jewish population one against the other. Israel is about split down the middle on the issue. It's a disaster because although there are some who are in the West Bank for religious reasons and others for nationalistic reasons, a great many people are being forced to settle there because of the economic incentives. And they're going to have an investment in the West Bank that's going to be very hard to dislodge. I think it's a disaster because if it isn't possible to trade some land for peace, one has to question what the exchange is going to be about and what the peace conference is going to be about, and why the claim that 242 and 338 are the ruling concepts can still be made. Most of all, I oppose it on moral grounds. I think it's a violation of international law to settle in occupied lands. That's certainly acknowledged by the not the Geneva Accords, but something like that. I'll remember in a minute. And that I think that Jews taking over Arab homes and uprooting Arab trees is not my concept of the way to settle our land. There's plenty of open space inside the Green Line. I don't believe that the current policy can go anywhere except towards de facto annexation. With annexation comes a question of whether you're going to rule over 1.7 million Palestinians without democracy. If so, it becomes an apartheid state. If you do allow for democracy in the annexed area, if they're fully Israeli, then of course there's the possibility that the democratic process will eliminate the Jewishness of the Jewish state. So those, I think, are fairly large risks. And I would like what Naomi Chazan calls a smaller, sweeter, safer Israel, the Israel that the original Zionist dreamers had in mind. Thank you.
Yes. Excuse me, could I ask you to hurry up? We have many people would like to ask questions.
Without going into the details, in terms of seeing that you have an answer, I'm feeling that I need an answer in a sense, because I'm seeing people who gravitate into this who politically are progressive on all kinds of other issues and seem to have a blind spot. And how does the Judaism that I feel I grew up with, or that I feel is consensus among a lot of educated people, how does that address this kind of fundamentalism of the return to the roots, but the roots including a total absence of any...
Okay, let me just rephrase that. What are we going to do about the fundamentalists in our midst who are pulling for a reactionary vision of Jewish life?
Well, I could answer that two ways. One is to share your fears And the other is to say, which I prefer to do, that we didn't struggle these last 20 years to create choices for ourselves, only to stand there and bar the way for someone who chooses something other than what we believe. So I am not going to condemn someone who is Baalat Teshuvah. I'm going to wonder what it is in their experience, history, current psyche that draws them to a fundamentalist ethic, that allows them to want to be part, it's like Groucho Marx, in reverse, to want to be part of a particular sect or segment of Judaism that doesn't fully value them, at least in our more progressive terms, in terms of the evaluation of women as equal human beings. I can't explain other people's needs, and I certainly feel the path should be open for them. But I have a suspicion, and some of the statistics would bear me out, that they'll be back.
You might recommend Loving Kindness.
Recommend Loving Kindness for sure. I would happily recommend Loving Kindness, Anne's novel about a mother whose daughter opted into a Hasidic community, was it? In Israel. It's very informative, and it reads like a mystery story.
Wait, enough. Let's get some more. Let's a little recommendation, not a long one. In the far back. The question is, how serious is the anti-Semitism that we seem to see on a terrific roll in this country at this moment?
I think it's growing, but not yet in the category of alarming. I mean, I see the same data you see. I see the American Jewish Committee and the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League statistics, which show that, yes, anti-Semitic incidents are on the increase, and certainly the media has paid more and more attention to them. I'm not sure that's a measure of true proliferation at the grassroots, but I think it's something we have to monitor. And most importantly, I think each of us has to devise for her or himself a posture. Are you going to be instantly defensive and then on the offensive, or are you going to hear this as a sign that we had better do some serious coalition building? We better get out there and educate other communities, not be strangers, not just go our own way on our own route with our own Jewish agenda, which in all frankness has shrunk to anti-Semitism, Soviet Jewry, and Israel. We have to start doing some of the coalition building around other issues that affect other communities as well as ours, and have that kind of build that foundation of unity or potential unity or empathy at the very least, so that one doesn't ever have to deal with anti-Semitism. That doesn't become an issue when there's understanding.
You're wearing a gray, it's you. You're looking around. Yes, you. Oh, sorry, I can't see too well. Would you stand up so we can hear you better?
Hi. I feel I'm traveling on a similar journey that you described. I also turned away from Judaism, from an Orthodox household, because I felt that I would act as a woman. And now I too am slowly turning back as a woman. And I want to reconcile these two. The organizations that you are involved with, Palestinian Jewish reconciliation, Black Jewish reconciliation, and maybe some of the others, I too would like to become more committed. What is the path that you possibly might recommend? Are there groups that you specifically can name in New York where I can develop more energy?
The question for everybody is, how can we immediately turn ourselves into activists? Where do we sign up? Tell us where.
For your spiritual search, what you've described as a similar journey to mine, an attempt to reclaim Judaism for you, not my fathers or your fathers, but a Judaism for us. I think in terms of affiliation, there's no substitute for synagogue shopping. You have to really sit in enough services to determine which one is egalitarian enough and yet traditional enough and has enough participation where you suddenly feel, this is my spiritual home. There are synagogues such as Anshe Chesed that have several different prayer groups. I haven't been to any, but I understand there are something like 6 or 7 or even 8. So you could start there and have a kind of cafeteria-style exposure. And I think that's a very healthy sign. The fact is that the Jewish community is recognizing the need for a kind of personally crafted spirituality, because otherwise we're losing Jews. We're losing Jews who feel alienated, who feel estranged, who feel excluded, who feel somehow or other this is somebody else's religion. And I think it's healthy that there's that much variety, because it's about the same thing. So make that effort. And in terms of affiliation through Jewish feminism, I would recommend you spend a couple of hours in the Jewish Women's Resource Center at the National Council of Jewish Women on 9 East 69th Street and look at the kind of groups that exist. Certainly read Susan Weidman Schneider's book, Jewish and Female, which has a lot of resources. But when all else fails, I hate to say it, you have to start your own. You have to just put up a sign at work or a sign on the bulletin board in your synagogue or at the next group of women that you happen to find yourself with, a large enough constituency. Put up a sign and say, I want to start a Black Jewish dialogue group looking for 3 other Jewish women who want to do the same. Then get any Black woman you know and ask, is this something that interests you? Do you know anyone who would be interested in this? I need to have a partner in starting this. That's how we started ours. A friend of mine and I, Harriet Michelle, who was the director of the New York Urban League, and I were among a very large group, about 60 members of a Black Jewish coalition that started in New York in 1984 in response to the Jesse Jackson campaign, with all the vituperation that, was beginning to gather around that. And that co-ed group was terrific as far as it went, but because men were not terribly self-disclosing and did a little bit of kind of role-playing for each other and posturing and telling each other how important they were, we occasionally found ourselves, rolling our eyes and saying, let's get to the substance here. And finally we decided that what we wanted was a women's group. And we started one. And very often people are a lot happier with something they start themselves than something they have to join. Yes?
Back to Black Jewish dialogue for a minute. I agree with you that trading the memories of the civil rights era are not going to bring us closer together. And I'm wondering, and I hope this is not a naive hope, but in your discussions in your Black Jewish discussion groups, do you find any common ground on the fact that Jews and Blacks have the same master story, the story of liberation and of Exodus and of leaving Egypt? And is there any hope there?
Precisely. Do you want to repeat?
Yeah, the question is there a hope for Black Jewish relations in what we will call liberation theology? That is to say, both groups share the same basic story of enslavement and liberation.
Yes. In fact, I deal with this point blank in the book very precisely and directly because the Exodus story means so much to me. And I have found it a bridge because it means so much to the Black people with whom I've ever been in dialogue, and we're able to use it as a common language. At the same time, you tend to run into the problem of competitive victimization. At a certain point, our slavery was 3,500 years ago, and theirs is within 3 generations. Our situation in this country is not comparable, as I said before. So I've become very sensitized to the need to not search for symmetry, but to search for symmetrical goals. We don't have to start with the same experience, and we both had the same pain. I mean, they acknowledge the Holocaust, but I don't need to constantly remind them that our people have been murdered. I once said, when you look at me and when you hear my fears, you have to remember that 1/3 of my family has been murdered. And any Jew that you ever talk to, 1/3 of their family has been murdered. And that's people alive right now. So when you hear us acting out of fear, to the same degree that you act out of rage, you'll understand. And that's been very helpful. So I think what you do is you play a kind of push-pull game of looking for unity and also accepting difference and not feeling threatened by it.
Yes.
As someone from Queens who also searched for a traditional egalitarian synagogue and found one, your book really touched me. I recently saw Rivka Hout speak and about the Women in the Wall movement, and it really upsets me that I can't pray with a tallit or read from the Torah at the wall. I'm glad to hear that the secular women's movement in Israel is alive. Do you see any real power for the religious women's movement?
Is there going to be any real power for the religious women's movement in Israel, I presume is the question.
Well, and the question also brings up a very interesting issue that has been the focal point of organizing and has cut across all religious lines, and that is the Women of the Wall demonstration. It started in December 1st, 1988 at the first International Jewish Feminist Conference in Jerusalem. A group of women who were there as part of the delegation decided that they wanted to go to the wall and pray at dawn. And they wanted to satisfy the needs of women who were religious up to the modern Orthodox and women who were Reform, Reconstructionist, and so on. And so they devised a service that would fulfill the needs of all. First time in Judaism, to my knowledge, that such a service has been done, and it was done by women. They went to the wall. They determined that it is halachically acceptable for women to pray with a talit and with a Torah at the wall, and to pray in loud voices at the wall. Despite kol isha, which is the tradition that a woman's voice is lascivious and would distract men from their concentration, from their kavanah. Despite that, it is halachically acceptable for women to do those three things at the wall, and this group of women went and did it. The response was horrendous. The mechitza, the divider, which is made of metal, was shaken to the point where it sounded like it was an earthquake, and men threw stones and paving blocks and metal chairs over the wall at the women who were praying. The police have stood by. This has happened many times since. The women pray at the wall on Rosh Chodesh. It has gone as far as the Supreme Court. To answer your question now precisely, many women's groups have issued whatever is Israel's equivalent of amicus briefs on behalf of the Women of the Wall, who have continued, as I say, since 1988 with monthly prayer groups there. The rabbi of the wall, Yehuda Getz, has, besides insulting them by saying things like, women need a wall like I need a pig, that sort of thing, Rabbi Getz has pressed the case. The case is now before the Supreme Court. At the moment, the court has, up until now, has ruled that women can pray with these three additions, which are offensive to those who pray there meaning men. But they have to pray in the archaeological gardens, which are way back. Can't pray at the wall. So we'll see what the upshot is, but I think that this, I write about this in the book because I think it is such a kind of quintessential example of the ability of feminists, when they really put their minds to it, to make unity real, to find a way to support religious women, whether you're religious or not. And the women in Israel have a comparable group across the spectrum.
We're going to take two more absolutely terrific questions. So, where are we?
I'll make this very brief, but unique. I just want to know how you can reconcile basic freedom of choice and your Judaism.
The question puzzles me. I presume it puzzles Letty too. The question I will repeat was how to reconcile women's freedom of choice with Judaism, with her Judaism. Judaism. I'm not. What particular conflict do you have in mind?
You're talking about the pro-choice issue? Oh, you're talking about abortion and Judaism. Well, I'm not a theologian. I'm not a Bible scholar or a Talmudist or a halachic scholar, but I understand that even they have found ways to justify abortion under certain circumstances. My answer is I am not an Orthodox Jew, so whatever they find, I reach my conclusions on a prophetic basis, a basis of ethics, justice, fairness, and the fact that women's lives matter, and that I'm not a fetus fetishist. That's how I reach my conclusions.
One last question, right here.
Hi, Mickey, classmate of mine.
What do you see as the future of Jews in America, given the assimilation, the intermarriage, and all of that occurs so often?
Oh, what a question to end on. What is the future of Jews given assimilation, intermarriage, and werewolves, etc.?
I love this question because I really do feel the future of Judaism lies with women. It lies with educating women. Because if there is to be intermarriage and a woman is the only Jew in the house, she has to be able to educate her children and to pass it on. You can't assume there's going to be division of labor and there's going to be a man who knows and a woman who does, who makes the house Jewish. But the woman has to know because she may be the only Jew in the house. So I think that the answer lies in education, and in a very different kind of education than we all received as children in Hebrew school, but an alive, rich, intellectually stimulating education, the education of discourse that takes for granted that women are smart and that women have something to contribute to an ongoing conversation that's 3 millennia old, or at least 1,000 in the written form. I feel that assimilation has its ups and its downsides. A measure of Jewish safety is the degree to which we're allowed to assimilate. But a measure of Jewish vulnerability is the temptation to assimilate. I think we should all be Americans in every way that we choose to define it, but I would hate to lose the continuity and the precious treasure of our heritage. So I hope that somehow or other we can again find a balance between the two.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.